to the first in a series of training missions designed to get you up and running with your new Mosquito aircraft. This first session will be a cockpit familiarization, as there is nothing worse than scanning all the switches and controls and trying to determine which switch does what. We will move in a clockwise direction, starting from the left-hand side, moving round all the way to the rear of the cockpit. So let's get started. Press your space bar to continue. Below your armrest to the left is the tail trim or elevator trim wheel. You can adjust your trim by assigning buttons or switches on your HOTAS, or by using your mouse. Moving your mouse pointer over the wheel and depressing the left mouse button for nose up, and depressing the right mouse button for nose down. Your inputs are registered here on the elevator trimming tab indicator. Next we have the navigational aid panel containing the beam approach and RI compass switches. We will cover these off in more detail in a future training session. Let's move on to the engine control box. Here we have the two RPM control levers used to control the RPM of each propeller. Below that is the friction adjustment wheel. It prevents inadvertent movement of the lever settings during harsh or combat maneuvers. To the top of the control box we have the two throttle control levers, and they can be set to control each engine independently. Normally, the throttles can be pushed forward to the stops only. When the small catches on the levers are squeezed, the throttles can be pushed forward. Next we have the mixture control lever. SU carburetors are fitted to your aircraft, and mixture is automatically controlled by the boost pressure. Here we have the supercharger gear change. Set to mod, the superchargers will remain in low gear at all altitudes. When this switch is set to auto, the electro-pneumatic rams are controlled by an aneroid and will automatically engage high gear when climbing. Below the engine control box is the VHF controller, used for radio communications, with preset channels A through to D. Further forward of that, we have your compass. This next dial is the beam approach rheostat and can be controlled via the mouse wheel. Slightly further forward is the wing tank release mechanism with a protective cover and release button. And finally, for the port side of the cockpit, we have two floodlight dimmer switches. That concludes the port side cockpit familiarization, and now we will move on to the center console and control column or joystick. Press your spacebar to continue. Starting at the top left-hand side of the center console, we have the boost control cutout handle, linked to the Merlin 23 engine. When operated, plus 14 pounds per square inch boost will be obtained in low gear. Next we have the remote compass indicator with a course setting rotary dial. Below that we have the RPM gauges, followed by two boost pressure gauges with fuel pressure warning lights to either side. Moving down again we have both the oil temperature, the inner dials, and oil pressure gauges to either side in yellow. Oil is supplied from two self-sealing tanks, one in each engine nacelle. Below the oil gauges we have the two radiator temperature gauges. And then down to the bottom right we have the port and starboard landing lamp switches. They can be operated using the mouse buttons. Depress the right mouse button for on and left mouse button for off. Next we have the instrument flying panel, and moving from top left to right, the first dial is the airspeed indicator. It displays in miles per hour. To the right is the artificial horizon, followed by the variometer positioned behind the fixed gun sight. Moving down and back to the left, we have the altimeter, including the pressure setter pinion. Next and to the right, we have the compass gyro and setter pinion, and finally, the turn and slip indicator. Moving your joystick out of the way, the panel behind the control column contains the undercarriage position indicator. It has a selectable dimmer switch or blind for night ops. To its right is the flaps position indicator. Directly below we have the port oxygen regulator, including control valve. The valve can be operated using your mouse. Depress the right mouse button for open and left mouse button for closed. Finally, we have the triple pressure gauge. If you are used to the Spitfire, you will already be familiar with its use. It indicates the pressure at each wheel unit and the pressure in the container. Let's move on to the control column or joystick. The first button highlighted has a dual purpose and can activate either the gun camera or bomb release. To the left of that, we have the cannon button, and to the front of the control column grip is your machine gun button. Moving down the control column and to the rear, we have the wheel brake lever. A part of the same mechanism to the front is the parking catch release. That concludes the column inputs, so let's move right and back to the centre console. The bomb door selector is a 3-stage lever. It can be operated with the mouse buttons to your HOTAS. Depressing the right mouse button will move the lever and close the bomb bay doors. In flight, when closed, the lever will automatically return to the centre neutral position. Depressing the left mouse button will move the lever down and open the bomb bay doors. Again, when the process is complete in flight, the lever will automatically return to the centre neutral position. Here we have the undercarriage selector lever and its associated safety catch. The safety catch must be released before up can be selected. During normal operation, the lever should return automatically to neutral when the gear up or gear down operation is completed. If the lever does not return when it is certain that the operation is complete, it should be returned by hand. Operation of the flaps is controlled by the lever marked F to the right of the undercarriage selector lever. The safety catch must be pushed to the right before flaps down can be selected. The selector lever should return automatically to neutral on completion of a full operation. Any flap angle up to 45 degrees can be obtained by returning the lever to neutral when the desired angle is reached, according to the position on the previously highlighted flap indicator gauge. The maximum flap angle is 45 degrees, although the gauge does read up to 70 degrees. The currently highlighted element is the gun master switch and must be set to fire in order to operate both the 20mm cannons and machine guns. The minimum pneumatic pressure required for operation is 200 pounds per square inch. Use your left mouse button to open the safety cover and your left mouse button again to depress the switch. The aileron trimming tab control and indicator are mounted below the gun master switch. All trimming tab controls work using the mouse. Depress and hold down the left mouse button to trim left as desired, and then depress and hold down the right mouse button to trim right. Moving to our right again, we have the ordnance and camera control panel. We will cover this off in more detail in a future training session, but for now, we will visually run through a number of dials, lights and switches. At the very top, we have the R1155 direction finding indicator. Below and to the left is the bomb doors warning light. Below that is the bombs or tanks stroke camera changeover switch. To the right is the bomb container and wing drop tanks jettison button. Next we have a perspex cover, which is opened and closed using the mouse buttons. Move the mouse over the catch and depress the right mouse button for open and left mouse button to closed. Beneath the perspex cover, we have the bomb selector and bomb fusing switches. And completing this panel section, we have the film footage indicator. Let's move up and right to the engine start panel just below the dash. Again, we will cover these elements in depth during a startup training session. First, we have a bank of 4 magneto switches, 2 for each Merlin engine. Then we have the electrical services switch, which when activated will allow access to and operation of the magneto switches, as well as supplying power to the on-board electrical systems. To the right, we have both the port and starboard engine starter and booster coil switches, including covers. Below those, we have the feathering buttons, 1 for each engine. And that concludes the engine start panel. Moving up, we have the final center console section that we'll be covering in this tutorial. First, we have the rudder trimming tab and indicator, the operation of which you can either assign to your HOTAS or use your mouse. Adjust to port using your left mouse button, and adjust to starboard with your right mouse button. Next, we have the port and starboard radiator shutter switches, followed by the air intake filter switch. And that concludes the center console. So we will move on to the starboard side of the cockpit. Press your spacebar to continue. First, we have the high-pressure oxygen valve, followed by the starboard oxygen regulator, including control valve. It is similar to the port version on the center console, and the valve can be operated using your mouse. Depress the right mouse button for open and left mouse button for closed. Moving right, we have box B, which we will break down into sections. Section 1 contains the identification switch, resin lamp switch, voltmeter, identification or Morse key, and generator warning lamp. The next section is predominantly associated with fuel levels, and the image shown now details the tank locations and fuel volumes. Starting from the top left, we have the fuel contents gauges inner tanks. Then moving right, we have the fuel contents gauges center tanks, and long-range tank if fitted. And moving to the right again, we have the fuel contents gauges outer wing tanks, all of which are displayed in imperial gallons. Moving back to the left and down is the windscreen wiper control, followed by the outside air temperature indicator. To the top of box B, and starting from the left, the first highlighted element is the gun camera switch. Next is the navigation lamp switch, followed by the UV lighting switch. Moving right, the next 3 switches are the pitot head switch, followed by the immersed fuel pump switch, and then the final switch in this series is the reflector gun sight switch. In our version, this switch has an additional benefit. You will recall during the engine starter section that we mentioned the electrical services switch. It's being highlighted now. As previously stated, its activation will supply power. We now have electrical power. Let's go back to box B and move your mouse pointer over the highlight. Your viewpoint has now moved so that you are in line with the fixed gun sight, and the sighting or aiming reticle is also displayed. Whilst we are here, we will run through the fixed gun sight. If you are already familiar with the Warbirds in DCS, you already know that this first rotary dial is the range setter ring. And below that we have the wingspan setter ring. Both can be operated using your mouse wheel. Let's go back to box B and run through the remaining switches. Before moving on, let's reset our viewpoint. Move your mouse pointer. Here we have the navigation headlamp switch, and next to it, the IFF master switch. To the right, we have IFF detonator push buttons and covers. Moving to the right again and concluding the box B controls, we have the fire extinguisher covers and switches. Let's move down to the entrance door, where we have the door opening handle. It can be operated using your mouse. Moving right and next to the observer stroke navigator seat is the VHF aerial winch. Finally, for the starboard side of the cockpit, we have the switch and warning light for the transmitter type F, as well as the master switches for the R1155 direction finder and TR1143 transmitter receiver. Now we will move on to the rear of the cockpit. By the way, you can change seats, which may help you as you view the rear cockpit elements. To enter the observer stroke navigator's seat, press key 2, and to return to the pilot seat, press key 1. Press your space bar to continue. To the very rear of the cockpit, and starting with the radio equipment, we have the T1154 transmitter. Moving right, we have the R1155 radio receiver control unit, and above that is the BC966A IFF Mark 3G transponder. Hanging from the cockpit frame, we have the magnetic loop antenna, which is part of the direction finding equipment. Next, we have the observer stroke navigator armoured headrest, which can be raised and lowered as required. Between the two seats, we have a cluster of engine fuel controls, starting with the fuel tank pressurization lever, followed by the two red dome-shaped port and starboard engine cutout buttons. Below those, we have fuel control levers, or fuel cocks, used for selecting and switching fuel tanks. To the right is the fuel transfer cock, which has simple on-off functionality. Directly below that are the oil dilution buttons for both the port and starboard engines. Moving to the right and controlling the oil supply for both engines are the oil supply levers. That concludes our rear cockpit tour, so we will move on to highlight a number of miscellaneous items not yet covered. Before we do, there are two of those items in this rear section. First, we have the gun heater lever, followed by the cabin heater lever. Moving round to the front of the cockpit, and situated in the footwell in front of the observer stroke navigator seat, is the Mark II drift sight recorder, used in the bombing process. And finally, above your head is the emergency exit lever and safety pin, which can be activated to release the canopy in an emergency. That concludes this cockpit familiarization session, and hopefully it has provided you with an insight into the many and varied instruments and controls in your new Mosquito aircraft. In the next tutorial, we will run through the aircraft startup procedures.